We are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today we're going to have a special show because you usually either see me with my co-host, Dr. Luther, who's still editing his book, or it might be the other Myth Vision guys. Today I have Jasper. How are you doing, Jasper? What's going on, brother?
Doing well, thank you.
Yes, sir. And he's actually from, if you're not part of the group, go check it out on Facebook. There's a mythicist versus historicist, or a mythical Jesus versus a historical Jesus Facebook group. And I met him through there and I said, you know what? Let's do a show together. This should be a very interesting show. It deals with the topic. Who was he? What was he? All those good questions. I'm going to be learning. This gentleman here today, Richard Smoley, and he's written 10 books. You've got to check out his book. Number one, the one we're going to talk about today is How God Became God. That's the book that we're going to be really dealing with. And you've got to go down in the description of this video. Make sure you guys get a copy of this book. And he's also got a new one coming out, A Theology of Love, Reimagining Christianity Through a Course in Miracles. Guys, go check it out. So, all right, you got it. Jasper?
Dr. Smoley, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm looking
Thank
forward
you. It's a pleasure.
Yes, this conversation should be very interesting. Given the depth of your learning about this, you've been at this for a very long time. Tell us a little bit about your background. I think you went to a couple of very well-known universities early on, and you are now a senior official at the Theosophical Society of America. Can you tell us about both ends of your career so far, and what you're doing at the Theosophical Society, and how you got there as a start?
Well, it's a long story, of course. My degrees from Harvard and Oxford are in classics and philosophy, and I've been very interested in the mystical traditions of the world, particularly the mystical traditions of the West, for a long time. For a number of years, I was editor of a magazine called Gnosis, a journal of the Western inner traditions, Gnosis as in Gnosis, which was published between 1985 and 1999. And I have written a number of books, probably the best known of which is called Inner Christianity, a guide to the esoteric tradition, although we're probably not going to be discussing too much of that book today. And for the last 11 years, I've been editor of the magazine for the Theosophical Society in America called Quest. So in addition to lecturing, speaking, and doing various other projects like this one. So that's a very short version, but it has been 40 years.
So in a nutshell, what does the Theosophical Society do? What is its point of view?
Well, it has three, it's called objects. The first is, it was founded in 1875 in New York by H.P. Blavatsky and a couple of other people. And its three objects are to promote the universal brotherhood of humanity, to foster comparative studies in art, science, philosophy, and religion, and to explore the potential latent in humanity. So those are the three objects. And if you want to join the Theosophical Society, you have to state agreement with those objects, which are rather general. You don't have to believe anything else.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's a freedom of thought resolution passed in 1926 saying no one can ever be thrown out of the Theosophical Society for believing or not believing anything, even the writings of the teachers, the founders of the Theosophical Society, and so on. And to my knowledge and experience, that has been completely true. So there is an enormous emphasis on freedom of thought and investigation in the Theosophical Society. I'm at the American headquarters, which is outside of Chicago. The world headquarters is in Adyar, which is in Chennai, used to be known as Madras, India. And it's been there since the 19th century.
Okay, that's interesting. It sounds a little bit like the Unitarian Universalist church, which I used to attend occasionally back when I lived in Vancouver.
It is, but it isn't a religion. There are a number of members of the Theosophical Society that are Unitarians. There's some overlap, and there's similar emphasis in freedom of thought, but it's not a religion per se. And we have many members from all sorts of religions.
So do you have atheists among your membership?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a guy who reads kind of what his equivalent of a secular humanist equivalent of a prayer every time there's some interfaith group. So yeah, there is. You don't need to believe in God at all.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a concept of God that you personally hew to, if I may ask? Because that's kind of one of the interesting questions. As somebody who's studied this as deeply as you have, where have you come to on that?
Well, my sons, when they were very young, asked me what God was. And I said, God is the source of everything. God is where everything comes from. And although that was a on the spot answer, I really haven't thought of anything better that I've been able to say since. Now, since this God is the source of everything, where everything comes from, it follows that nothing you can see, no object in this world as we know it or conceive it, can be God. It is also very unlikely that God, in the ultimate sense, is personal. But we have to amend that by saying, well, we exist as persons, and this absolute can relate to us personally. A typical Christian would say that God is absolutely personal. I don't know enough either to say this or to deny it. But I think the source is capable of relating to us, and we're persons, so it's probably capable of relating to us in a personal way. Whether it relates to a galaxy or a microbe in the same way is frankly rather unlikely.
So here's my favorite question to ask people in this context. Here it is. Would you disagree or agree with the following claim? The laws of physics are constant throughout space-time in this universe. They're exceptionless. They apply throughout this universe, throughout space-time. There's a set of physical laws that always apply and are exceptionless.
No. You want me to explain?
Yep.
These laws of physics are going to be completely different 100 years from now. They were completely different 100 years ago. So even, so the idea is, yeah, they're changing all the time. So they have no absolute truth.
Okay, hang on. I'm not talking about the laws of physics that we happen to know about so far. I'm talking about the laws of physics as if there is a set of rules according to which the universe unfolds that we may know some of and not yet know others of, but these apply exceptionlessly throughout space-time. It's not like you're not going to see suddenly gravity no longer applying for a few minutes here and there. You're not going to see, bumps in the consistency and constancy in space-time of the fundamental rules according to which the flower blooms.
I think it would be presumptuous to claim that you knew that. And if science is claiming that, it as in many other ways, is being arrogant and presumptuous. Science is useful, but it has made many more epistemological claims that it can really support. And these claims, stated and unstated, are one of the fundamental problems with our civilization today.
Okay.
So I don't know, maybe they apply all over. I don't necessarily believe in the laws of physics as they are. Scientists will not believe in these laws of physics 50 years from now because science is constantly changing.
Yeah, no, I wasn't really talking about the specific set of physical laws that we have hypotheses about now, or that are working hypotheses that we're using now, which have allowed us to build smartphones and rocket ships, by the way, and to understand what DNA is. So they can't be entirely wrong. But I'm not saying we have the final truth. It was the principle, the idea.
They're also destroying this planet.
Yeah,
all the things that are destroying this planet are also the creations of science. And if it were not for the scientific worldview and the scientific mentality, this climate crisis, which I assume you believe in, being a rational human being, would not take nearly the form that it has. So I am no lover of science. I respect it, but it has become a false god that is as pernicious as its own right as fundamentalism.
Okay, well, we can agree to disagree on that one. But let's move on to the question of the origins of the idea of Jesus. Now, this is something that both Derek and I have been fascinated with for a long time, and as you know, so are billions of people around the planet. Mm-hmm. And it's this extraordinary obsession with the story of a particular, well, apparently a man is what's usually thought. Most people believe there was a historical Jesus whether or not they actually are Christians, whether or not they accept the idea of, that Jesus is your savior, that if you believe in this, you get eternal life, and all these kinds of stories that are told within Christianity. And I came across something that you wrote. It's called an article called "The Strange Identity of Jesus Christ," which I thought was just fascinating. And I would like you to tell us what you have learned and how you learned it about exactly that, about what it says in that article, setting aside the question of historical Jesus person or not, just the idea that particularly the Apostle Paul had his Christology. What did he think Jesus was? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, just to forestall or provoke later debate, I do believe in a historical Jesus, and it is a question, and I'll explain why if you want to get into that. But let us say who the early Christians thought Jesus was. Now, when I say the early Christians, I mean the Christians who wrote the New Testament. There were lots of other Christians out there who believed all sorts of different things, ranging from the idea that Jesus was just a man like everybody else, to the idea that he was kind of a specter who just sort of, I suppose what the Tibetans would call some kind of apparition. We don't know anything about these people except for the writings of their enemies, which are not to be taken at face value.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say what the Christians who wrote the New Testament believed. And they believed, well, for one thing, there was this figure in Jewish mythology who was extremely important, far more important than is given credit for, Metatron, or the great angel. Now, this great angel, was regarded in Jewish circles at Jesus's time as second only to God himself. He was sometimes referred to as a deuteros theos, a second God. And how do we know this? Well, he's described and discussed fairly clearly in the writings of Philo, who calls him the archangel with many names. And what were some of these names? The Logos, the Word, the Son of God, the Son of Man. Is starting to sound familiar?
Yep.
So that is who the early Christians thought Jesus was the incarnation of, including Paul, including to all appearances, the authors of the Gospels.
Okay, so let me just pick up that ball, because we've gotten right to the meat of what I wanted to speak to you about today. At the time, in the first century Christian era, in Jewish communities at that time, there was a common understanding, if I'm understanding you correctly, that there was this archangel, sometimes called Deuteros Theos, and Deuteros Theos, the second God. How does that relate to either the idea of Yahweh or of the demiurge that the Gnostics, that we know from later Gnostic writings? There was also the idea that the God that some people had, that an evil God created the world, or an imperfect God created the world, whereas the perfect God had created that imperfect God through some complicated process earlier on. But that is not Metatron. Metatron is a purely positive or good figure, if I understand you correctly.
Yes. I think we have to separate the Gnostic concept of the demiurge, which we can discuss separately, because that is, much later and not really in the Judaism of the time of Jesus, or very much beforehand. The Jews, by the way, were radically monotheistic originally. That is to say, they believed Yahweh, God, and his story of Yahweh is another long one, which I go into in how God became God. But they believed that he was the source of good and evil. In fact, it says it in Isaiah. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. I, Yahweh, do all these things. If you're a radical monotheist, which we are not today, at least Christianity is not. Christianity is sometimes characterized as semi-dualistic, which is probably fairly accurate. But the Jews in Old Testament times were monotheistic. Everything came from Yahweh, good and evil. It was only later shall we say, post-exilic times after the exile in the 6th century BC, that these forces were starting to seem to bifurcate. And you can see that in various texts. The Book of Kings will say that Yahweh tempted David to create a census of Israel, which for some reason he wasn't supposed to do. Chronicles, written after that time, says Satan tempted David to do that. So you can see in 3 centuries how that piece of thought started to evolve, and Satan became kind of Satan's role in Judaism is another story, but that started to detach itself. So Yahweh was the source of everything. And as I think you were saying, perhaps in a conversation before we started recording, there is this concept of the angel of Yahweh, who is not really very well distinguished from Yahweh in the texts themselves. Like for example, the 3 men who visited Abraham, considered to be angels, and one of them was Yahweh. Wow, isn't that weird? How do we know this? Because they're about to leave, and Abraham says, wait a minute. And the original text, as the rabbis themselves admit, say Yahweh turned and talked to Abraham. Now the text was changed to have Abraham turn to Yahweh, but that was an admitted and known change, just because, yes, this angel was Yahweh. I mean, if you really want to get into Yahweh, we can. There was a universal high God in Canaanite mythology, was called El, right? Mm-hmm. Then all these other nations had their own national gods. And the national god of Israel was Yahweh. The Israelites weren't supposed to worship these other gods because they were born of other nations. They didn't really care much what the other people believed because they weren't Israelites.
So it wasn't that they thought there was only one God. They thought that there were many gods, but they only, as a particular people, should only worship that particular God, Yahweh. They recognized at the time that there were other gods, and above all of these different tribal gods, there was the high god El. That's how they saw it?
Initially.
Yeah.
In, say, 1000 BC.
Okay.
In around 600 BC, there was a movement, a radical Yahweh only movement, sometimes called. Mm-hmm. And these people said El, the high god, was Yahweh, or Yahweh is El.
Yeah.
In the Bible, you read, the Lord is God. Well, this sounds like a rather dull, platitudinous thing. But to say in 600 BC, to say Yahweh was El was a very radical statement. Mm-hmm. So suddenly, the national God of Israel became the universal monotheistic gods. There weren't any other gods. They were either demons or they simply didn't exist. That was a change in Israelite theology that can be kind of documented in the Old Testament.
If you don't mind me poking right here, just to say, do you also agree, though? I know William Dever, I believe it is. He's a famous archaeologist on biblical history and stuff. He suggests that Yahweh used to be married to Asherah. Do you tie in some of that stuff in all of this discussion here? And you said earlier, radically monotheistic. That was toward the 600s, correct? Because I think you kind of just said 1000 BC. They kind of had multiple layered, tiered gods, and El was the top supreme, and then they kind of morphed them together. Am I right in that? And do you think the Asherah was Yahweh's wife, and they changed?
Well, yeah. Can you hear me still?
Yeah,
because you're cutting out. Okay, you can hear me. Fine. Okay. Yeah. Well, in pre-exilic times, that is to say, before the exile, the sack of the first temple in 586 BC, the queen of heaven, Asherah, was worshipped in the temple most of the time. There were occasional reformist kings, the last of whom was Josiah, who threw her out and had this Yahweh only movement. But it is it seems rather unlikely that this is what most people believed. And most people believe that, yes, Yahweh had this consort named Asherah. And there's archaeological evidence for this to Yahweh. And, there's very little archaeological evidence for Yahweh before the exile. But a lot of what there is does link him to Asherah. Now, this is an interesting point is made in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah, after the sack of the temple, Jeremiah is telling the Jews, hey, we brought all this on yourselves by worshiping the Queen of Heaven in the temple. And they said, yes, yeah. When we worshiped the Queen of Heaven in the temple, everything was great. When we threw her out, now the whole temple has been sacked. So yeah, we're going to continue to worship the Queen of Heaven. So yeah, it was widespread in this kind of reformist, radical monotheistic movement. Who knows how popular it was before the exile, because all the biblical books were written by these people. But after the exile, it took over Judaism. Judaism it started to morph into the Judaism we know today. I mean, that's very, very, there's a lot of stuff there, but it is an attempt to answer your question.
There's a close parallel in what you are just discussing with what happened in Islam, I think, a few centuries later, which is that for a long time, they worship both Allah and Allat. Allat being the female consort of Allah. Allah just means the God, and Allat means the goddess. And at some point, they decided to become fanatically monotheistic, and it was only all about Allah. And the tragedy, of course, is it denies the female principle and demotes half of the human species to an inferior status. And this is a mistake that's been made repeatedly. I don't know exactly why, but there it is.
Well, there are volumes and volumes written about the sexual politics of the last 3 millennia, and it's a huge subject. The difference in Islam is that Islam was able to consolidate its position much earlier than Judaism was. In Judaism, this all sort of took place over centuries, so there are fragments of it. But for example, the Quran was codified in the early 8th century, and they brought in all the texts, and any text that didn't agree with the original as they deemed it, or the correct version, were just burned. So there's no textual problems in the Quran because they made sure this is the Quran and that's it. How much it actually had to do with what Muhammad uttered or whatnot, well, it's anyone's guess. And it would probably be rather physically dangerous to guess a little bit too publicly about this.
Yes, I have to say, though, that my perception of the 3 Abrahamic religions is that Islam, in its spirit and in its culture, is much closer to classical or pre-first century Judaism than it is to Christianity. It seems to me inspired everything from kosher meats and halal meats to circumcision to the radical patriarchy concept and the stonings and the sort of the nasty God Old Testament stuff. Allah is not a nice God. He's like a harsh, punishing God. In the same way that the Jewish God of the Old Testament is, whereas the Christian God is kind of relatively, one gets the impression anyway, relatively soft touch compared to the other Abrahamic God ideas.
I think that's basically true. And I sort of think that it's possible that the Prophet Muhammad may have viewed the Arabs he didn't view the Arabs as the children of Ishmael, and sort of was trying to create a religion for the Ishmaelites, as he imagined, similar to what the Israelites had. Mm-hmm. Again, it would probably be dangerous to say that in terribly many contexts, but basically I agree with you.
Now, one of the really exciting things about having this conversation with you, Dr. Smoley, is, again, let's get back to Metatron a bit, and to his twin Sandalphon, right? Apparently there are these 2 archangels that have complementary roles, and they're thought of as twins, so I was reading. Now, I wanted to know, how do we know, what is your textual evidence for your proposition that what Paul had in mind was, in fact, Metatron or Sandalphon? From when and from what texts do we know of the legend of Metatron? When does that arise in religious history of Judaism? And what textual evidence do we have for that? And then tie that into how that became the idea of Christos Jesus. And I'm not quite finished yet, because to me, one of the interesting points here is when we have Paul referring consistently to Christos Jesus and his idea that the death and resurrection of Christos Jesus is the absolutely crucial fact that you need to believe in, because then by sympathetic magic, you too will experience resurrection after you die. And this Christos Jesus seems to me not to be a name, but to be a title. As far as I know, it means anointed savior. So Jesus actually refers to the idea of salvator or savior. It was used as a name by a lot of people, just like a lot of Mexicans are called Jesus today, right? But actually, I think that if we think that Paul had in mind an archangel savior figure, he wasn't talking about, Bobby Jones. It was not a name. Christos was not a first or a last name, and neither, I think, was Jesus. Christos Jesus would mean anointed savior. That fits very well with this. It's a generic term. And one of the questions I have for you, is it possible that this generic term was used by him in the epistles because he didn't want to call the archangel by his actual name, because that may have been something that only initiates into the mystery cult were allowed to know? Maybe it's not something you would write an epistle and send around. Maybe it's something that only for the higher level initiates, because they had a lot of, if I understand correctly, at the time, they thought names were incredibly important, and invoking a name could be, sort of a dangerous thing. Just like some Jews today, they will not write G-O-D out. They will put G-D because of some superstition that it's going too far to name God. So with all of that, contextual questioning here, let me know, where did this Metatron idea first arise? What's the textual evidence for it? How far back does it go? And how do you feel fairly secure in your view that Metatron is what people had in mind who were the early Christians?
Well, the earliest, where the absolute earliest evidence for it is, I don't know. But I will take some fairly early evidence for you, and let's see if I can find it here in the book of Daniel. Let's see. Where is that?
So I'm going to hit Google now.
Oh yeah, Daniel 7:13 is part of his vision. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. That's Daniel 7:13. Now, the Son of Man, angels were often, by the way, called men by the Jews, esoterically, as in the three men in Genesis. So this idea that the Son of Man was this high angel, the ancient, this is an echo of the old days when El was still the high God and the great angel Yahweh was second. This is still an idea that's persisted into like 165 BC when Daniel was written. This Son of Man was used in that sense in a generic way in that particular text, Aranash. But partly as a result of this text, this Metatron came to be known as Son of Man, among other things. The name Metatron is, no one knows where it comes from. The most likely explanation comes from the Greek metatutranu, meaning the angel with the throne, and the throne is another thing we can get into. So that is kind of one piece of evidence that this figure was extremely important. And the idea probably developed between the time that Daniel was written in 165 and the time of Christ, 165 BC. Now, here, the key text as far as we're talking about with Paul is Philippians 2, where, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So this is saying that this second figure, almost as high as God himself, became a man. And you and I differ because I believe in a historical Jesus as opposed to a purely mythical Jesus. We may simply not be able to agree on that point, and that's fine.
Later on, we can talk about why you believe that. And
sure,
let's
okay.
set this aside for now.
And it said, wherefore God also hath exalted him and given him a name which is above every name, and so on. So what was happening in Christianity was, as nearly as I can see it, was that there was the second God, many names, Metatron, the Son of God, the Son of, whom they believed was incarnated in Jesus and who suffered and died on the cross and was raised and so on. And after his death was exalted to the right hand of God. That is to say, he kind of became equal with God. And this is the genesis of the doctrine of the Trinity. Because, hey, you know, what?
Is this God that he became equal with? Is this Yahweh or is it El?
Yeah, or the Father. Well, in those days, the Christians believed that Yahweh was El. That whole thing was long since gone. I mean, these ideas are in a sense confusing because the picture is confusing because there are lots of different beliefs, lots of different times. You know, people didn't have consistent, you know, uniflat theological opinions or beliefs any more than they do today. But at that point, well, Jesus was equal with God. Well, I guess that must mean he is God. And at that point, the idea of the sacred ternary, sacred three, which is universal, sort of got incorporated in. Well, I guess there must be three. Well, there's the Holy Spirit. And that over the first 3 centuries of Christianity came to be how Orthodox Christology and doctrine of the Trinity evolved. So that's that. But yeah, so that's who they thought Jesus was. I'm not saying I thought Jesus was the incarnation. I'm saying this is what I don't know who Jesus was personally. Who knows what happened to that?
So this is a topic that we have discussed a lot in this Facebook group that Derek and I are part of. And we could probably have a very lively conversation about that. I don't think either Derek or I have a firm opinion on whether there was definitely or not a historical Jesus Christ, but I certainly have come to the point where I think that we know essentially nothing about that. The question for me, I think there probably were people who declared themselves to be messiahs who, for example, led the revolt against Rome in 66 CE and who were treated essentially as messianic figures. The question is whether any elements of the biographies of such figures crept into the theology either of Paul or of the writers of the Gospels, or whether the writers of the Gospels were talking about something else entirely. So that's the distinction. It's not, you know, were there any human figures who declared themselves messianic leaders of the Jewish people? I think, yes, there were. I think the Dead Sea Scrolls make that fairly clear, and so do other sources. I think that, however, they are not necessarily that about which Paul was talking. I think about which Paul was talking was what you're talking about here, which is this archangel. And this is a fascinating thing that is not generally known, and it deserves to be. It deserves to be very much known, Dr. Smoley. So what I'm going to ask you is, can we make this case that you are making, or have you perhaps already done so in writing, in a way that, you know, will stand up to peer review in a historical journal? You know, what is the evidence that we can put forward that would make this case as clearly as possible based on the evidence, the actual historical evidence, textual evidence that we have?
Well, I must correct you on one point, which is that I am not a doctor. I don't have a doctorate. I have a master's from Oxford, and that's about as high as it goes.
Okay, well, I have a master's too, so we'll call each other master. I'll call you Master Smoley, you call me Master Zimmerman.
But, you know, and I've never been an academic as per se. You know, and I'm more and more grateful that I'm not, because that is a very constrained world.
Yeah.
And you can't really, particularly when religion gets into the picture, you can't really diverge very much and still stay academically reputable.
Right.
So, I mean, I've read a lot of peer-reviewed publications. I've never published in a scholarly journal per se. My books are, to a certain extent or another, popular books. So But I think, having read enough of the scholarly literature, I think this is what it's saying. I want to add one thing about Metatron, because there's one very interesting piece of evidence regarding him. Well, if Metatron was so important, he was a second god among many Jews, including Philo at the time of Christ. What happened to him after? Where did he end up? And there's a text called Third Enoch, which casts some light on this. There is a figure known as Aher, whose real name was Elisha ben Abuya. He was a real figure who lived around the turn of the second century. And he was called Aher, meaning the other one, because he did a bad thing and he became a heretic, probably a Christian. This is alluded to in the Talmud. In Third Enoch, Aher goes up into heaven and sees the angel Metatron on the throne, remember the throne?
Yeah.
And says, there are indeed two powers in heaven. And curious thing then happens. Some other angel shows up, flogs, makes Metatron stand up from his throne, and flogs him with a fiery whip, 70 times or so. Now, did this happen in some esoteric, angelic realm? Who knows? But I think this is what it's saying, is that at that point, like in the 2nd century AD, this idea of this second god, Metatron, was leading too many people to Christianity. And as a result, they had to demote him in their theology, which they did. Metatron is still a figure who appears in Jewish legend and Kabbalistic teachings long after that. But he no longer has anything like the status that he had, say, in the time of Philo.
Now,
so I just want to add that. So that is one piece of evidence, well, where did he go? Well, that's Christians decided he was Jesus. So it was Jesus.
yeah.
The Jews decided he's getting a little big for his britches, so to speak. So he has to be demoted radically. And that's
Right.
where what happened to the concept of Metatron as a result of Christianity.
I understand. So one of the things that we discussed on our Facebook site about mythicists versus historicists perspectives, about this idea that Metatron and or Sandalphon, his twin, archangel, might actually be the basis for Paul's idea of Jesus, i.e. what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we talked about there was, well, where did he get this idea? And it apparently may come from something called Merkava mysticism. That there's a particular strain of Jewish mysticism, which is around the idea of, they call it Merkava mysticism because Merkava means chariot. And it had to do with, there's some imagery, somebody had some dreams that got very popular and published in the scriptures about God being on a flaming chariot and so on. And that idea of the heavens having these palaces and chariots and things seems to be where these kinds of archangels fit in. And a couple of interesting questions arise. One is, when did Merkava mysticism arise? Because again, it's a question whether the timing fits in with where Paul's, own writing fits in. So people think that he wrote around 50 CE. Was Merkava mysticism a big deal then, or was it a small minority sect then in Judaism? How did it fit in to the general picture of what it meant to be a Jew 20 years before the fall of the temple, the Second Temple?
Well, how many people, I would have to assume that the number of people who practiced Merkava mysticism was very small, just as is the case of, the number of Kabbalists today. They're always a small part of the population, but they're usually extremely erudite, so they write, and, you see more of their writings than you did, the ordinary slob who believed in who knows what. Merkava mysticism has its origin conceptually in the first chapter of Ezekiel, in which Ezekiel has a vision like this of a throne and a chariot with a man in it. Remember the man on the throne? That's another place where that shows up. And later, Merkava mystics, who I don't know when it exactly arose. My my strong impression is that it was very much around the time of Christ and Paul. And there's even an allusion to this in one of Paul's epistles, in which he says, I know a man who was taken up into the third heaven. And what, the third heaven, well, it goes back to what you're talking about, the palaces, the Heikalot. There are different levels of heaven. And Paul is saying he's taken up to one of them. Now, sometimes there's supposed to be 7 of these. Sometimes there are only supposed to be 3. Who knows which of these systems Paul was using and was alluding to there. But he probably practiced, he's talking about it very circumspectly. I know a man who was taken up in the spirit up to the third heaven, but most scholars would say, yeah, he's really kind of talking about himself without trying to brag too much. So he probably did practice this kind of mystical ascent, which probably was a type of what we would call, an elaborate visualization, probably accompanied by lots of fasting and austerities and that kind of thing to raise your level of consciousness. I don't think there's a great deal on how it was practiced, because this stuff was always transmitted orally. So what about its practice, how it was actually implemented, I think is only really known through kind of oblique references in the written material. I think there are Kabbalists who still practice something like that today. I think the tradition has lasted, but how much what they do now resembles what Paul did is moot.
Question. Yeah. I was going to say, you brought up some interesting things, and I'm kind of going back, but I want to kind of stay in the first century according to this. When we were talking about Yahweh being a man, okay, we talked about Yahweh being a man with Abraham. There were 3 of them. I tend to see these as stories. These stories carry some type of possible esoteric meaning. I don't find them very historical in nature. So when I get to the New Testament and I see this midrashic type literature that's copying Old Testament literature, I literally was just doing a video the other day about Joseph being Jesus. Like, you can literally show him going into the dungeon, the 2 men, one's the baker, one's the wine. There's the bread and the wine. Eat of my flesh, drink of my blood, and you will inherit eternal life. Do this in remembrance of me. Joseph tells the wine bearer, remember me, when he goes to Pharaoh. Then he's seated at the right hand. It's a story. Now, in the New Testament, I like the question of the historicity. It's a fascinating one. I enjoy it because I get tug of war all the time. Like, was there a guy that was so mythologized? It's not, was he mythologized? Was he so mythologized to the point to where, what can we actually even really know? We can go and try and use references saying Crestus. We can try and go to Josephus and say, hey, well, the Testimonium Flavinium, we'll go to the other reference. We can use these things, but what can we actually know about this guy? And if Paul's theology is this, could they have a concept of saying, we're going to take Metatron, and he's this actual guy over here on earth. This is a real guy. We're going to apply a deity concept to a real guy. Is that something that can even happen in their theology? And if so, could there have been many Metatrons that have been, applied to humans throughout history? Because I just don't see this would be like, out of nowhere, we're just going to do a new thing and apply it to an actual guy over here on the earth. Does that make sense?
Well, here's what I would say about Jesus historically. I think the core story in the Gospels is true. There was a man named Jesus who started to preach around 30 AD, and he managed to irk the religious authorities, who managed to get the Roman authorities to kill him. And after that, some of his followers experienced him. They saw what they thought was a risen Jesus. None of this is innately implausible, because there are plenty of people, it's even quite common, who have dead friends and relatives appear to them soon after death. So it's not at all improbable they could have had this experience. They obviously decided that this must have meant that he was a special figure. Whether he allowed people to believe that or not, whether he himself believed that, I don't really know. I mean, the only title he really kind of alludes to, as far as he's concerned, is the Son of Man. And that's a bit ambiguous, because does he mean Son of Man in the sense of the great angel, or does he mean Son of Man in the way that it's used in the book of Ezekiel, where God calls Ezekiel Son of Man over and over and over again? Or was Jesus playing with his ambiguity? Will we know? I don't think so. I think mythic elements, biblical stories, of course, were projected onto Jesus. Well, for example, like in Matthew, for example, you have, instead of the flight from Egypt, the flight into Egypt. How historical is any of this? I have to say, I don't know. I don't think, barring someone getting a copy of the Daily Bugle of Jerusalem from AD 33, anyone's going to really know. Or that is to say, any evidence more than what we have, anyone is going to know.
If you don't mind me just kind of like telling you where my frustration in all this is, and this isn't with you, it's just the whole question is very frustrating, because when I hear, for example, and you're not the only one who says, hey, look, in the first century, I think there's a core. Everything that was described there, I see in the story of Joseph. I mean, his brethren, right? What did Jesus do? He came and he was rejected by his brothers. Well, his brothers are considered Israel. They reject him. Well, look at Joseph. He's rejected by his brothers. The middleman are his brothers, so to speak, or the brethren that reject him. And here in Joseph, he's given to the Ishmaelites. Then the Ishmaelites give him to Egypt. In Jesus' story, he's given by his brothers Judas to the high priest, or to the Israelites, the council, and they give him to Pontius Pilate. Potiphar and Pilate end up in the same location in Matthew 27 when you parallel Genesis 37. So when I see this midrash and I follow that same theme, the same narrative plays a part. And so when you start seeing the same narrative, you got to go, really? I mean, is any of that actually historical, or are they taking contemporaneous things to create a fictitious, esoteric story? It's so hard for me to say, okay, this is a repeat of a history. I just don't see history repeating itself that coincidental in that order. I tend to think it's a narrative. And that's kind of where I'm struggling, is like, okay, if there were historical elements that are in the Gospels, I tend to think they're borrowed from Josephus or some historical source and applying it to some contemporaneous meaning. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but like even the death, burial, and resurrection, the only part that I would say isn't necessarily found in Joseph's story, even though one could argue it's in Moses' story with the serpent being lifted up in the wilderness, the crucifixion, right? Everyone goes, well, the Romans crucified. We know that's legit. Well, Josephus has 3 friends that get crucified in his autobiography. He asks Titus to take them down. Under a physician, 2 of them die and 1 survives. Could they have applied this Josephus historical event back here into this fictional gospel story and created a narrative? It's very tough. It's very tough. And to say with absolute, like Bart Ehrman does, I don't know. I have a hard time. I'm not the professional, but that's my frustration. And I don't know if you see where I'm coming from or not.
Yeah, I see it, and I sympathize with it. I mean, there's this huge continuum of, Jesus, exactly the way he's portrayed in Gospels, Jesus, complete myth. And there are a lot of different positions you can take in the middle. Mine is to say, well, there are a lot of, and there are a lot of esoteric elements in it that were included. Going back to Origen in the 3rd century says, not even the Gospels are entirely true. Certain parts of it are true. Parts of it have deeper symbolic meaning that was added later. Well, he doesn't say specifically which it is, which parts are and which parts aren't, but this was always known. And the only difference between you and me is that I probably see a little more truth in the core story than you do. And that's a difference of opinion. And, there's no point in trying to force each other into agreement.
Oh, no. Yeah, I'm not.
I understand. I see your frustration.
I'm not even, I'm willing to go over. If I was shown a little more like solid, like this is the case, I would definitely, I'm agnostic on that. I could be a historicist tomorrow, you know what I mean? And some days I am, and some days I'm back to mythicism, because I just find this so, I don't know if we'll ever have enough evidence.
I'm trying to find something right now, which I unfortunately can't. I about 3 months ago, maybe came across something I wish I could post right now so our viewers could look at. There's a gentleman who did a really detailed analysis of the Gospel of Mark, which is the chronologically first gospel, where he identified the source or the parallel in the Septuagint and in other sources of every line in the Gospel of Mark, right? Where does it come from? And he color-coded them to correspond to different sources and basically said, here's the entire text of the Gospel of Mark, and let me see if I can identify its antecedent in the Old Testament and in other sources, and see what's left over after I've done as much of that as is possible. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm going in the direction of what Derek is saying. When he was done, there was almost nothing left, right? And what this suggests very strongly, and there are a couple of other authors who are members of this Facebook group who've written books about this. I think, is it David Oliver Smith, or what's his name, Derek? Who's done similar work, who essentially are saying that the Gospel of Mark, which is chronologically the first one, is a very carefully constructed work of literature, drawing from existing scripture and recomposing that in a work of allegorical fiction that's meant to make certain theological points. And if I were to summarize what my understanding at present is of what the points that the Gospel of Mark is trying to make, was essentially written right around the time that the Second Temple was destroyed, and it was trying to explain why that happened, why Yahweh would allow that to happen to his chosen people. And the answer was more or less, you should have listened to Paul and Paul's message about Christus Jesus, and then this wouldn't have happened. You've gone astray. You've been arrogant about your racist idea that the Jews are the only people that deserve a relationship with God. And Paul was trying to explain to you earlier this century that was not the case. And because of your apartheid mentality and trying to force the Romans out, you brought destruction upon yourselves. I think more or less that's the sort of the take-home message of why this was allowed to occur. And he puts this message, and in fact, apparently he puts a lot of phrases from Paul's epistles in the mouth of this literary figure, Jesus, okay, which is the key figure in the Gospel of Mark. So he basically created a composite figure and put him in what you could call a historical novel. He put it in the context of a particular place and time under Pontius Pilate, which was a time maybe 40 years before the thing was actually written, and sort of said, well, and he had this Jesus figure from back then say, I foresee that in 40 years' time, Jerusalem will be destroyed, and there will be a wall built around it, and so on. So it had this Jesus figure predict the destruction of the Second Temple. Obviously, the writer already knew about the destruction of the Second Temple. That's why he had to put the Jesus figure in the past in order to be able to predict it. Right? So it's a work of historical fiction. It's more Harry Potter than it is historical reportage. And like Harry Potter, it has moral and ethical lessons that it's meant to convey. And the very carefully calibrated structure of it, there are all these kinds of structures within it, which are kind of ABBA or ABCCBA structures throughout. This indicates what a carefully composed work of literature it was. And the more carefully constructed a work is, the less plausible that it has in any sense aspects of historical reportage, especially when you can trace pretty much every important event, including the crucifixion, to Old Testament sources. And the crucifixion is the point of the whole thing, right? It's just like it's the point of Paul's message, because the idea is that the Gospel of Mark really maybe should be called the Gospel of Paul. We don't know who Mark was, right? Maybe it should be called the Gospel of Marcion or Marcion. It probably was pronounced Marcion, in fact, not Marcion. And the Gospel of Marcion was based very much on the works of Paul. So Marcion and Paul were maybe the real originators of Christianity, of what became Christianity, although other things were, as you pointed out, the Trinity idea and so on, were added on as a certain stream within the Christian churches, competing cults, became orthodoxy, and then was imposed in the councils of Nicaea later on, a particular single story. The whole point from the Roman Empire point of view was to impose a single narrative on the whole empire to try to create political unity. It didn't work, but they tried. And that's why they then declared the Roman Empire to be a theocracy with just one single religion and no tolerance for any alternatives. And they used, why did they use Christianity in 380, I believe it was, CE, when Emperor Theodosius imposed this? Well, because by then I guess it was very popular, and it made sense for to choose that particular story. So what all of this says is there are excellent reasons in my reading of the situation. I had no pony in this. A year and a half ago, I was a historicist. I thought there must be a historical Jesus at the core. And then I started reading about all this stuff. And more, as I've seen more sophisticated analyses, especially the textual critic analyses of the Gospel of Mark, where the other Gospels are just fan fiction on the Gospel of Mark by people who had different theological perspectives. So they took the material of Mark and then they changed it around and added to it and so on, to try to get their own idea across. Like Matthew was more into the idea that you still had to follow the rules of Orthodox Judaism and the Mosaic law, whereas Mark had explicitly said you don't, because Mark's perspective, like Paul's, was that stuff is all superseded. It's no longer necessary, and you can invite Gentiles into the church without asking them to, cut their foreskins off or to, follow all kinds of obscure dietary laws. And so Matthew didn't agree with that, so he rewrote the Gospel of Mark and corrected a few geographical details that Mark had got wrong. It looked like Mark probably was never actually anywhere near Palestine. And so that's how this whole thing originated. There's a really interesting book by a guy called R.G. Price, not to be confused with Robert M. Price, R.G. Price, another not a professional theologian, but like you, somebody who deeply interested in this stuff. And he wrote a book called Deciphering the Gospels. And he covers all of this in some detail. And that pretty much convinced me that what we're looking at in the Gospels has nothing to do with historical reportage at all, and that we really need to look for the source of the original Christian Christologies, the original Christ ideas, to Pauline epistles, to the epistles of Paul, and also read the Gospel of Mark in that light as being an allegorical, pseudo-historicized novel intended to convey certain messages. And it would have been read that way by the first Jewish Christians who would have been familiar with the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, and would have recognized all of these stories that were being recycled, as midrashic recycling. And it was later Gentiles who didn't know those stories who mistook this quickly, actually, or quite quickly afterwards. They started mistaking the Gospel of Mark for historical reportage. They didn't understand the nature of that text. It's like somebody taking a Harry Potter book and thinking this is historical reportage about a guy called Harry Potter. Sure, maybe it's mythologized a bit, but basically there was a guy called Harry Potter, and this is kind of, the core of that story must be true. So that's where I've come to as my working hypothesis, that probably that is where we're at.
And now this is why we have you. We're thinking you're onto something with your theory, and well, actually, Spencer's brought it to my attention because I don't really have my head wrapped around this, but we have you heard of Earl Doherty?
No.
He has a angelic Christ figure that pre-existed, and we see elements of this in Pauline literature, like in Philippians. And in the book of Philippians, which is claimed to be one of the original Paulines, not a pseudo-Paul, it suggests that this Jesus is a pre-existent angelic figure, or at least some type of pre-existent figure who comes down, takes upon flesh, and comes to earth. Well, the historicists, like Bart Ehrman, they see that, but they're like, that's just myth. The real guy came, and they mythologized him into making him from a man into eventually a god. The Earl Doherty, or the Doherty thesis, is saying, listen, this was an angelic person who's euhemerized by people who are ignorant of these mysteries. These mysteries had an angelic figure, so to speak, or a pre-existent type figure that comes and then is eventually euhemerized into a human, or like made in the narrative, he becomes man, okay? But literally into history as an actual person. So mythicists come from that angle, working inward, and the historicists start with he's a man and work outward into a mythology. And a lot of them make these arguments, which tugs me back and forth, because they go, well, look at the Caesars. We're going to say the Caesars. We know they existed, and then they're mythologized. However, I've asked this question to countless scholars who've come on my show, and I say, okay, were they like 99% hocus pocus mythology, or were they like mostly historical? And once in a while you go, well, yeah, there was a comet that told us birth, or a virgin birth, or he healed a blind man with spittle, or that's like here or there. Jesus is wholly like enormously mythology. And so that's kind of where we're at. We pulled you into this because we thought you're onto something. So I'll shut up and let you guys keep going.
Well, let me
let me jump in here and say, all this said, let's get into what this is really about. Yes, there are allegorical myth elements in the Gospels. Why are they of any interest to us? And they're interested because they do have an allegorical, symbolic meaning. And the one, perhaps the most important element in it for us, is that Jesus, the Christ, is a symbol of the true I, or the true self in man. This is known as the Atman in Hinduism. It has the true self, the high self, has all sorts of names. It is what we really are. It's the only part of us that's eternal. But it is totally obscured and occluded by physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, opinions. That's what meditation is to do. To like, oh, what is really here? This I, this true I. Oh, by the way, what does Jesus call himself in the Gospel of John? I am. Well, this is that in us, which says I am. And the Gospels are, I believe, stories about the liberation and the awakening of this true self, called the Son of Man, the Son of God in the Synoptic Gospels, the I am or the Kingdom of Heaven in the Synoptic Gospels. I mean, the Kingdom of Heaven, that's what the Kingdom of Heaven is and it's about. And Jesus is the story of Jesus is the story of all of us, you know.
That's one way of looking at
it. No, let me finish. God comes down to earth. He kind of runs around, he lives in plays his part, and it's in this time, makes friends and enemies. Eventually, he suffers a painful and humiliating death on a cross known as time and space. But that doesn't really matter, because what is true and eternal about him lives on. That is the story of Jesus. That is the deeper story that we read into Jesus, and that is the truth we see in it, whether or not we believe in the story, the literal truth, or whatever. That is what I see the core truth is, and why it remains important and interesting today. And that's what my book Inner Christianity is about. So, in terms of the mythology, you could go in any length of the gamut that I've just talked about. Mythology.
What was that book? Just plug that book one more time.
Inner Christianity.
Make sure you guys get that if you're interested in what he's discussing here. So, okay, and
I mean, because that's what it is, and this means that the story becomes relevant, and it's a guide to our own spiritual awakening. And there are huge symbolic levels. There are three levels. Remember the three heavens. There are three levels of reality: earth, earthly reality, psychological reality, and spiritual reality. These are symbolized in the New Testament by stone, water, and wine, respectively. So the water is drawn out of the stone, right? The stone cisterns at Cana, and then it's changed. It's an account of this transformation of inner self from the outer stone element and into the spirit. The stone is always the external, the dead level. Who of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? The symbolism pervades the whole New Testament, and it's talking about these levels. So yes, it was written on that. How much of this actually really happened? I agree. We don't know. But I believe that symbolic element, and this is found from the earliest writings of the church fathers down to my little book. It's always been known, and it's always been kind of buried, because the external authorities don't want you to look past the level of the stone, because usually they're not much past that themselves.
Right. I was about to ask you.
Sorry, what? Say that? I'm sorry, you cut out.
I was about to ask you why the authorities don't want people to read these texts in a sort of more mystical way. One of the core characteristics of Christianity for the past, 1,500 years or so has been to insist on a literal reading of these texts. And this is actually a fairly strange thing. Maybe it's to keep it simple or something like that, but they went to great lengths they committed entire genocides, like in southern France at one point, to wipe out so-called heresies, where a more allegorical and mystical reading of these ideas was practiced, and perhaps a reading that, according to what you're just saying, is closer to the original spirit of the thing.
Yes, the Cathars, even the Catholics said that the Cathars were closer to the original Christians than they were. So yes, I agree with you. Let me explain it as I see it. A spiritual movement begins, and it has genuine spiritual power and life. It attracts followers. If you attract followers, you gain power. And the more power you gain, the more likely you're going to attract leaders who are interested in power. And if you're interested in power for its own sake, you don't really care that much about spirituality, because you don't understand it that well yourself, and you just assume nobody else did. So you don't know anything about it, and because you're the ecclesiastical authority, you have to step on everybody else who does. And that, is, I think a reasonably concise, if irreverent history of Christianity in the first, 4 centuries.
Oh, yes, I agree with you.
So it is, something has spiritual force, and then it becomes about power, and it becomes all about power. And the real spirituality, if you're lucky, doesn't die out completely, which it does in some religions, but it always kind of exists on the edges. And, as you know, the mystics have always been, highly suspect to the Christian authorities. Mm-hmm. Meister Eckhart in the 13th century is only saved from the Inquisition by the fact that he happened to die conveniently before they could actually condemn him. So and this goes on, all along the line. And so that is it. It's it's a power not of this world, but the powers of this world aren't going to like it.
So one of the things that you said there was that you thought the story was about the true self, or the true I, mm-hmm. and that this was the eternal part of the self. Mm-hmm. I have to admit that as somebody who studied neuroscience, where the evidence is that as parts, let's say somebody has a stroke or gets involved in a car accident and part of their brain is destroyed, then that part of the person goes missing, right? There are certain capabilities that go missing. And the more damage there is to the brain, the more it goes missing. And the sort of, you take that to its conclusion, the suggestion is that if the whole brain goes missing, if you die, then you're gone. And so this idea of an eternal I is something that personally, I think probably doesn't exist. Now, I may be wrong. There may be some sort of meta-dimensional shadow, or, sort of like a magical computer in another space-time connected to this one through a dimension I don't know about, which stores, some version of me that we call my spirit. I have no idea. I don't think that's very plausible, but I could be wrong, okay? So what I'm wondering is, do you think that there is such a thing, or do you think that this idea of an eternal I, or a true self, like, what does that even mean? To me, that is a phrase that doesn't really mean anything if you look at it hard. What do you think it means?
It is that in you which is witnessing everything. You can, if you meditate, you can start to witness your own thoughts, emotions as images on a screen. So who is watching? It's that's watching. Does it survive the death of the brain? Well, I don't know. There are a lot of near-death experiences that suggest that it does. And if we're being really scientific, one thing I don't like about science is when it's talking about empirical evidence, there's a whole range of empirical evidence that it dismisses out of hand because it does not fit in with accepted scientific theories as known. And this has to do with the religious experience of man, the paranormal experience of man, the mystical experience. This is all nonsense because we cannot account for it in our neurology. And it doesn't fit into our worldview. Since I'm dissing science for a minute, let me go on. because the scientific worldview is about to collapse.
No, it's not.
This is the most important thing that's happening in our time, because it has come up with two quite contradictory claims. One is what you just said. Consciousness is totally a function of the brain. Our cognition is highly circumscribed by our neural system. Well, then you can't go and then say, and reality itself may be very likely very different from our cognition of it. Well, you can't then turn around and say the results of our cognition, which would include scientific evidence, cannot be anything more than, shall we say, a very limited human perspective on what it is. Yet it's always claimed that this is really the way it is, and scientists tend to believe that that's really the way it is. Well, let's put it this way: naive realism, the view that the world really is the way we see it is not taken by any serious philosopher, unless you count Ayn Rand.
Now, Mr. Smoley, I was going to say, if you don't mind me just plugging one thing I heard said that what I like to do. See, I was a very fundamentalist Christian who was super spiritual. And then I went, and as I started to, I guess you'd say, research and try to make sense of some of these things, I started looking at stuff more naturalistic and say, what makes sense in a natural world? And one of the things we were talking about, as we were talking about over time, how they didn't want this information to get to the common folk, is the spiritual or practical. So when we talk about the spiritual, why this movement would take off and why it became popular, in light of the movements that are around, it seems that Christianity had some practical applications that I think almost everybody was crying out for, that people really liked the idea of love and mercy in a way that wasn't expressed before. There were things that were practical in a natural sense that were applicable, and we could say they're spiritual, because obviously there's no way to test it except for the fact that I personally find it's a subjective experience, and that to themselves that experience is true. It might be for a Hindu, their experience is true. It might be for a Christian, their experience is true. It's all subjective. But just like you're saying the natural world can't necessarily go into the metaphysical and try to make sense, the same vice versa.
Not exactly what I said, but go on.
My gist is that if there is a natural explanation, is that this is a better version of religion than what was being already, I guess you'd say, espoused out there. And then that the powerful that saw that they could control this thing and control people took it and ran with it. And here we have, people not being able to practice this stuff. They're being killed for this stuff. And I myself, I have experiences all the time. I don't say that they're not experiences. I don't. However, today I say, what if there's a natural explanation on top of the fact? It still doesn't make me not have these experiences. Does that make sense? So I don't have to run around and go, that was the Holy Ghost. Like a fundamentalist would go, I just experienced the Holy Ghost. I tell Christians all the time who are like, Derek, are you saying you're an atheist? I'm saying, I don't know what I am. I just know that I experience things, and I'm a practical spiritual person. I think these principles work regardless if you think there's some divine beyond you or if this is something in your own conscious state, whatever, they work. So I go ahead. I'm sorry, Jasper.
I would just add an agreement with what Derek is saying. I see it the same way, and I would contest one thing that you said a minute ago, Mrs. Smoley, is you said that scientists dismiss all of these experiences, these mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, paranormal, what have you. That's not true at all. Scientists do not dismiss those. I did all the coursework for a PhD in neuroscience 20 years ago. I find that stuff absolutely fascinating. And, like the fact that consciousness even exists as an emergent phenomenon in this universe, and it clearly does have something to do with the brain. It certainly has something to do with the brain, right? It does seem to arise from the workings of the brain, at least while we're on this planet. The fact that it even exists is a mind-blowing phenomenon. It's the deepest mystery that I know of that we haven't sorted out yet in this cosmos. So scientists do not dismiss it. We just don't try to make claims about it that are that go beyond the evidence, right? And so
you're not taking all the evidence into account.
Well,
I mean, yeah, there are mystical experiences, and they're always written off. Like near-death experiences are written off. Yes, they are. Maybe not by you, but by lots of people. Oh, well, the near-death experience where someone's actually looking down in the operating room and describing things that happened to them, even though they're in a coma. You know, it's a lot of this stuff is written off. Maybe not by you.
You're insisting that it's written off, and I'm telling you that I personally don't write it off. And in conversations I've had with other people who are professional neuroscientists, which I am not, but I nearly became, it is not written off. It is an open question. We don't try to pretend we know what is going on there. It is a fascinating phenomenon, just like the fact that all of us are conscious every day and that we experience consciousness makes us think that it's some sort of banal thing, which is an obvious thing. But actually, it's not. What's going on, and it's just mind-blowing what's going on, is that you have literally 100 billion neurons sending electrochemical signals to each other throughout this massive tangle of wiring, and somehow that generates a coherent gestalt moments of consciousness that feels like a singular I, like the I am in this moment I, right? That is not something that we really understand at all. Why would different neurons in different parts of the, different alliances actually, of signaling neurons in different parts of the brain at every given moment give rise to this gestalt moment of consciousness? How does that actually work? That's an unresolved question of both science and, if you will, spirituality. I think you're taking a dogmatic anti-science perspective.
No, I'm saying that science has posited itself as the only legitimate arbiter of truth, which it is not. And if it has not posited itself that way, it has allowed everybody to believe that it is. And I'm sorry, that includes many scientists. It doesn't include all scientists, but includes many. Moreover, this naive materialistic worldview that science can explain everything, or will very, very soon, because there's always this promissory explanation. Well, maybe your theoretical model is completely defective. What you just said, all about that, it doesn't explain anything. So maybe your theoretical model needs to be scrapped and rethought entirely, because it's not explaining anything, as you just admitted. But no, it's this theoretical model of all these neurons firing. We're going to explain consciousness someday, real soon. And the explanation would be very, very much like our current preconceptions. I think that's bullshit.
Well, Mr. Smoley, I appreciate you coming on, and Jasper. No, but you know what? I think this is one of my favorite shows that we've done, and Jasper's right. It's good that it's good there's tension, because it spices up the discussion. It shows I had a good show with Dr. Eisenman, Robert Eisenman, who's a Dead Sea Scroll scholar. Man, he was chomping on Christopher Lawson, and Christopher wasn't even against him. He was just trying to discuss, and Robert's like, I'm not talking about the Qumran cave scroll of this, and they got a little tension, and I'm like, you know what? I'm just listening, and I'm thinking in my head, Jerry Springer. But look, this is good, because a lot of people
watch Jerry Springer.
I know, and I'm saying this is good because the outsiders looking in can see what Jasper's saying, can see what you're saying, and say, where do I fall on the line? Is there a historical Jesus? Is this an angelic type godlike figure? I love this. Everybody needs to get your book, check out his book, How God Became God, correct?
And, let me just add one thing. I mean, I don't expect or need you to agree with me. And I don't have or expect you to agree with me any more than you might have at the start of this conversation. So I'm happy for the dialogue. I think it's important that these views are aired in all sorts of ways. And I think you're doing a great job in making that possible. The idea that we're all going to have to, there is often an idea that if everybody doesn't walk away from the sort of thing with a consensus, it's a failure. But I really don't think that's true, and I doubt that you do. But I do very much appreciate the opportunity of having me on. Just to send me a link so I could let my people know about it.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Jasper. It was fascinating. You're quite right. These subjects are not easily resolved, and part of the way of resolving them is by endless conversations like this, which may amount to something somewhere.
You know, where we do, I think of the three things that we talked about tonight, one I think we're very much in agreement with, and the other two less so. So where I think we're very much in agreement, the reason we ask you on is your perspective about the great angel, the idea that Paul thought, you know, of his Christus as essentially this archangel. And I want to follow up on that more. And Derek, let's see if we can find other people that are knowledgeable about that, get them on the show.
Yeah, you know who you should call? Margaret Barker.
Okay, Margaret Barker. We're gonna make a note of that.
Absolutely.
You know who she is?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Margaret Barker's a very well-renowned scholar on temple theology, and she's well aware of a lot of the stuff we even discussed with Asherah. She's aware of Yahweh.
A lot of the ideas that I'm getting come from her book, The Great Angel.
Write that down.
Yeah, you know, get Margaret Barker talking about the great angel. She's.
By the way, one thing I wanted to mention that seemed to me must be the case. The Book of Revelations is kind of Merkava mysticism based, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's a whole different show in its own right. But yes, there are some elements of that. Anyway, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm very, very sorry about the whole Skype business, that computer.
We're fine, no problem. Look, ladies and gentlemen, get his book. It's on Amazon. It'll be down in the description. A Theology of Love, Reimagining Christianity Through A Course in Miracles, a spirituality based on love, not fear, by Richard Smoley. And he has How God Became God. Let me get this subtitle here. How God Became God, What Scholars Are Really Saying About God and the Bible. And you want to go check that book out. It's $7.99 on Kindle. It's not a lot. Paperback's $12.91. Go check it out. And I also want to give a special thanks to you, Jasper. I really appreciate you joining in. You're really good at this, and I'd like to have you join us again, bringing scholars on, because you make it a very good conversation.
Yeah, I thought it was a great conversation, and I really enjoyed it. So I hope you have a great day. Jasper, I hope you have a good night, because it's what, like 10 o'clock your time?
Yeah.
Oh, look, 9 o'clock. Oh, yes, okay, yeah.
I appreciate you two gentlemen, and like us, subscribe us, share this Myth Vision podcast. Do you have any closing words, Jasper?
We are
Myth Vision.